The air in the observation post, deep in the tri-border area, wasn't just hot. It was thick, wet, and smelled of decaying vegetation and recycled fear. We had been static for 72 hours, watching the bend of the Bang River, waiting for the logistical surge that headquarters promised was coming. Sergeant Rourke, the point man and the unofficial leader of Hydra 5, wiped the condensation from his starlight scope for the 10th time, his eyes burning with the relentless strain of vigil. Waiting, Rourke knew, was the true enemy of a grunt. Combat was immediate, finite, a transaction of life and death concluded in minutes. Waiting was corrosive, eating away at discipline and sanity, filling the gaps with paranoia and memory. The radio, sitting beside the nervous F&G spinner, remained obstinately silent, amplifying the symphony of jungle insects and the drumming pulse in Rourke's ears. Our mission profile was simple: confirm movement, count the heads, and extract silently. Simple, until command got involved. Rourke had a deep, visceral distrust of the maps being pushed down from Danang. They were bureaucratic documents, clean lines drawn across brutal topography, always optimistic, always deadly. He trusted the dirt under his fingernails and the gut feeling that had saved him from 3 tours worth of mistakes. Doc Chavez, resting his head against a mound of sodden poncho liners, whispered about the ghost stories of the valley, the forgotten platoons, the walking dead left behind in the Eshao. Rourke hushed him, not out of annoyance, but because the silence needed to be absolute. They had seen movement, 2 columns, heavily burdened, moving toward the crossing. Far more than HQ's projected light resistance. The waiting was over. Now came the agonizing decision of how to leave. Rourke keyed the mic, reporting the confirmed enemy strength, at least 2 reinforced companies, possibly more, moving anti-tank weaponry. The confirmation sent a ripple of static through the air, followed by the crisp, overly confident voice of Lieutenant Harper, 40 kilometers away in the relative safety of the rear base. Harper acknowledged the intelligence with a detached formality that chilled Rourke. Good work, Hydra 5. Proceed to extraction, routing you via Alpha Corridor. Immediate movement required, ETA 0400. Rourke froze. Route Alpha. His blood turned to ice. Alpha was an ancient path, notorious from 66 through 68 for being a systematic NVA kill zone, saturated with defensive ordnance. Specifically, it cut right through the sector everyone knew was nicknamed the Nursery, a vast, known field of Czech-made Tripwires and U.S.-abandoned M16 mines, the dreaded Bouncing Bettys. Rourke's intel packets, scraped together from local montagnards and older unit logs, had bright red cautionary markings over Alpha. This wasn't a mistake. It was suicidal negligence based on months-old intelligence reports that claimed the NVA had cleared the area for resupply. Rourke gripped the handset so tightly his knuckles were white. Negative command. Repeat, negative. Alpha is saturated, confirmed mining activities, high density. Harper's response was immediate and sharp, laced with the metallic arrogance of a man reading from a prepared script. Sergeant Rourke, your refusal is noted. Clearance reports state Alpha is green. We have air support availability window limited to Alphas LZ. Beta is too long, unverified. You will proceed on assigned vector immediately. That is an order. The order was simple. The consequences were complex, measured in body bags. Rourke knew Harper would sacrifice 4 men to keep his operation timeline intact. The internal conflict was a violent, silent war fought entirely behind Rourke's eyes. He could follow the order, walk his men straight into a known field of bounding mines, and die cleanly under the banner of duty. Or he could ignore the only direct, definitive order he had been given in months, choose an unverified route, and face a court-martial if they survived. He looked at Chavez, meticulously counting bandages, then at Spinner, whose young, terrified face was reflected in the dull sheen of his radio casing. Rourke made his decision. He lifted the handset, listened to the buzzing frequency where Harper waited, and deliberately depressed the off switch before the lieutenant could issue another threat or rationale. The ensuing silence in the cramped OP was heavier than the gunfire they were trying to avoid. Rourke leaned forward, his voice low, firm, stripping away all emotion. "We are not taking Alpha. Command is operating on faulty intel. Alpha is the Nursery. We're taking Beta." He pointed to the map, tracing a ragged, looping path that skirted the northern ridge. Beta was overgrown, slower, exposed them to a longer duration of transit, but it skirted the confirmed danger zone. "If we hit something, it's going to be NVA ambush, not an indiscriminate mine. I can fight an ambush. I can't fight an entire field of Bettys." Chavez nodded instantly, understanding the gravity of the defiance. Spinner, however, looked utterly lost. "But," the lieutenant said, "it's a direct order, Sarge." Rourke stared at him. "The only order that matters out here, Riley, is survival. If we take Alpha, we're dead by 0300. If we take Beta, we might make sunrise. We move now. Keep your intervals wide. And if you hear a metallic pop, hit the dirt and pray." They abandoned the observation post, leaving behind nothing but carefully placed junk to suggest they had been there longer than 2 hours. The transition onto Route Beta was immediately punishing. It was not a trail. It was a vertical wall of triple canopy jungle, requiring constant machete work, draining their already limited water supply. The air thickened with insects drawn to the disturbance. Rourke kept a pace that was agonizingly slow, paranoid about leaving clear signs of their passage. Every few minutes, he would halt the patrol, listening for the telltale sounds of counter-tracking. It was during one of these tense pauses that they found the confirmation that solidified Rourke's defiance. Skirting a huge cluster of thorny bamboo, Rourke spotted a barely visible strand of nylon fishing line, stretched taut between two low-hanging ferns. It was a tripwire, not NVA standard issue, but locally sourced, indicating a persistent, long-term defensive deployment. Rourke signaled a halt, using careful hand motions to indicate danger. Following the line further back into the gloom, he discovered where the tripwire led, directly across the faintly discernible path that was Route Alpha, the path Harper had ordered them onto. The line was connected to a cluster of tin cans, which, if disturbed, would trigger a flare or worse, a fragmentation charge buried nearby. "See?" Rourke muttered, pointing at the crude setup. "They didn't just clear it. They booby-trapped the entrance." The realization hit Spinner hardest. The lieutenant's order hadn't just been wrong. It had been a guaranteed slaughterhouse. The weight of Rourke's ignored order suddenly felt less like mutiny and more like salvation. They had to cut away from Alpha completely, sacrificing valuable time to bypass the deadly fringe. The detour pushed them deeper into the maze of Beta, forcing them to move laterally across a steep incline. The jungle seemed to breathe malice, every shadow a potential threat. They navigated for another 90 minutes before the topography abruptly changed. Instead of the thick, protective canopy, they found themselves slipping down into a narrow, muddy ravine. This area, Rourke realized instantly, was too neatly maintained. There was an unnerving lack of natural detritus. The ground cover was suspiciously dense in places, yet sparse in others. Spinner, breathing heavily under the weight of the radio and his own fear, lagged momentarily. He planted his boot firmly to gain purchase on the slippery mud bank, and the sound that followed was sickeningly wet and soft, a muffled collapse rather than a crack. He wasn't falling, but the ground underneath his foot gave way entirely. Rourke reacted instantly, grabbing the strap of Spinner's pack and wrenching him backward just as the young man's other leg plunged into the earth. It wasn't a mine. It was a cleverly concealed punji trap, a deep pit lined with sharpened, feces-smeared stakes. It had been covered with a thin mat of vegetation, designed to snag and incapacitate. The depth of the hole suggested it was aimed at supply carriers, not just patrols. They were no longer simply avoiding minefields. They were now directly infringing upon a major, active NVA supply and defensive line, confirming the density of enemy activity Harper had so confidently denied. The discovery of the trap forced a third, critical course correction. They couldn't move further down the ravine. They had to climb back up the ridge line, pushing them east. The problem? East was the direction of the original objective, and worse, east led them directly toward the secondary perimeter of the Nursery minefield. Climbing the ridge was exhausting and slow. Rourke tried to maintain the pace, knowing the noise created by the near miss with the Punji pit was a flashing beacon. The heat was relentless, wringing the last reserves of energy from the men. They were now moving through a sector of high elephant grass and low brush, a transitional zone that served as the natural boundary between the NVA's active supply lane and their deep, static defenses. Rourke, moving point, felt a shift in the air, a subtle alteration in the visual landscape that set his teeth on edge. He saw it first. 3 smooth, light gray stones stacked carefully atop a crumbling termite mound. An NVA field marker. His stomach dropped. They were on the edge. The immediate edge of the very minefield he had refused to enter. Ironically, the NVA defensive infrastructure they had encountered had forced them into the quadrant Rourke had successfully avoided for the first leg of their journey. He signaled a halt, holding up 5 fingers to indicate extreme danger. Doc Chavez, second in line, carefully advanced to Rourke's position. "How close, Sarge?" he whispered, his voice dry with fear. "Too close," Rourke ground out. "This is the fence line. The Bettys are right in there." As he spoke, Chavez inadvertently planted his heel on a clump of vines. The vines were wrapped around a tripwire too low and too brittle to see in the dim light. There was a faint metallic ping dash, followed not by a bounding mine, but by a vicious, immediate burst of fragmentation. A small, secondary command-detonated charge, designed to slow or cripple, not necessarily to kill. The force of the blast was localized, but shrapnel ripped through the air. Spinner, standing just behind Chavez, let out a choked cry and collapsed, clutching his thigh. The shrapnel had nicked his femoral artery. Not a direct hit, but enough to cause catastrophic blood loss if not treated immediately. The small explosion shattered the oppressive silence, replacing it with a ringing echo of violence. Before Rourke could even assess Spinner's wound, the jungle erupted. The NVA, alerted by the blast, started laying down harassing fire from an unseen position further up the ridge. They were pinned between enemy bullets and the known, marked minefield. "Chavez, get him stable now," Rourke yelled, pushing the medic toward the wounded Spinner while drawing his M16 and laying down suppressive fire into the high grass. The combat had arrived, but the terrifying duality was that they couldn't maneuver. Every step back was a step deeper into the known minefield. Every step forward was a step closer to the NVA firing line. Rourke realized their only viable option had become the very extraction route he had ignored, Route Alpha's LZ. If they could skirt the minefield perimeter, moving fast and desperate, they might still reach the rendezvous point before Harper canceled the flight window. He had disobeyed the order to walk into the field, only to find himself forced to sprint across its boundary under fire. "We are moving. Extraction LZ Alpha. Single file, watch my feet. Do not deviate." Rourke screamed over the gunfire. Chavez, working frantically on Spinner's leg, nodded grimly, already securing a hasty tourniquet. The air was thick with the scent of gunpowder and hot copper. Rourke threw a smoke grenade, green phosphorus, to conceal their dash. He had seconds of cover, but they had to use those seconds to cross the most dangerous ground in the entire valley. The smoke grenade deployed, creating a thick, acrid curtain of green and white that momentarily blinded the NVA firing positions. Rourke plunged into the fog, moving the patrol in a tight, desperate line. He pulled out his standard-issue bayonet, dropping to a crouch, and began the agonizing process of probing the earth inches ahead of his boots. The knowledge that he was deliberately navigating the fringe of a bouncing Betty field was a suffocating terror. The NVA knew the safe lanes. They knew the gaps. Rourke bet his life on the assumption that the heavy concentration of enemy fire was coming from positions outside the minefield, meaning the area directly in front of the firing line might be relatively clear of their ordnance, if not ours. They moved 5 yards, then 10. The adrenaline was a painful fire in Rourke's veins. He heard the metallic thunk of an incoming RPG impacting the trees 20 yards away, tearing down branches, but they kept moving. Chavez followed, half dragging, half carrying the whimpering spinner, whose face was pale and slick with sweat. Rourke heard the subtle shift in the terrain under the third man's boot, a barely audible crunch that wasn't earth. He froze, holding his breath, listening for the immediate follow-up sound of a firing pin releasing the spring mechanism. Nothing. It was a fragment of wood, or perhaps an empty ration can. The nervous tension was crippling. Rourke probed again, the bayonet tip hitting soft earth. Then a sharp, unmistakable clink dash. Rourke froze, his heart hammering against his ribs. The bayonet had struck metal, shallowly buried. He didn't dare pull it out. He moved his foot slowly, agonizingly, placing it a half-inch to the left of the strike zone. He risked a glance backward. Chavez was watching him, eyes wide and expectant. The NVA fire intensified, spraying the area with automatic rounds, forcing Rourke to press the matter. He had to assume this strike was simply a large piece of shrapnel or forgotten debris, not a live mine. He took the next step, pushing the possibility from his mind. It was then, amidst the chaos of incoming fire and the smell of burning jungle, that Rourke heard the distinct sharp click, not from his own steps, but 15 yards to their right, deeper in the field. Someone had stepped on the pressure plate of an M16 mine. Rourke screamed, "Down, down, down," before the scout could even react. The mine mechanism was activated, the delay timed perfectly for maximum lethal effect. A dull, subterranean thump followed, and then the bouncing Betty erupted from the earth, reaching hip level before detonating with a concussive blast that ripped through the trees and sprayed shrapnel outward in a devastating cone. The explosion wasn't aimed at them, but at the NVA scout who had followed them too closely into the perimeter. The blast wave struck Hydra 5 like a physical hammer, covering them in hot earth and jungle detritus, but it also momentarily silenced the immediate threat and, more critically, cleared a ragged, smoking path through the jungle ahead. The blast had unintentionally blown a gap in the perimeter line, pointing directly toward the LZ. Rourke scrambled to his feet, ears ringing, blood flowing from a superficial cut on his forehead, but miraculously intact. He saw the black smoke plume rising, confirming their proximity to the designated LZ. "Go! Go! Now!" He hauled Chavez and Spinner forward, using the breach in the perimeter created by the enemy's own error. The remaining distance was a desperate, headlong dash over ground that had been violently rearranged by the blast. They hit the clearing, the official extraction LZ Alpha, just as the unmistakable rhythmic thump of the incoming Huey's rotors filled the humid air. The extraction was hot. The pilot, anticipating trouble, wasn't settling. They scrambled aboard, Chavez shoving Spinner into the cabin, Rourke leaping on last, turning to lay down a final, desperate burst of M16 fire into the tree where the NVA were reforming. As the Huey lifted violently, pulling G's to escape the valley floor, Rourke looked down at the devastated perimeter, the smoldering field, the dark gaps in the foliage, the silent proof of the carnage he had sidestepped, then inadvertently traversed. He had disobeyed the order to enter the minefield, and, by doing so, had ultimately been forced into the most dangerous route imaginable. Yet they had survived. The chopper climbed high above the valley. The radio crackled once more, clear despite the rotor noise. It was Lieutenant Harper. "Hydra 5, confirm extraction. Report why you were off vector for 2 hours. Explain your deviation from Route Alpha." Rourke's hand was inches from the handset. He looked at Spinner, alive but pale, and back at the silent, deadly jungle below. He lifted the mic, but instead of speaking, he simply keyed the button, holding the transmission open. The lieutenant's voice was instantly swallowed by the deafening, life-affirming roar of the rotor blades, the sound of the only order Rourke would ever need: survive. He didn't say a word, and then he closed the transmission, his silence a final, definitive answer.